welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to create this amazing, beautiful piece that you can see here. This is actually a princess seam that is running from the armhole with a peplum, a puff sleeve, a cuff, and a waist belt. Can you see how beautiful this piece is? Oh my god, I'm in love with this outfit. I love the outcome of this dress, and I hope you would too by the time you see the process in achieving this garment. If you're new to my channel, you're welcome. Please click the subscribe button and click the bell so you get notified whenever I post new videos. And guys, this tutorial is actually amazing. You need to actually create something like this. So let's get right into the tutorial so you can see how we made magic here.
For this tutorial, we're going to be needing a princess seam half bodice block. I have a tutorial on how to draft this very quickly and easily. It is not a long tutorial, okay? I'm going to link it in my description box. If you know how to draft this, or if you have a princess seam block, by all means use that. This is the fabrics that we are going to need for this tutorial. I'm going to be using this Ankara fabric in combination with this shirting fabric. So that's what we're going to use to create our stylish bodice. So what I'm going to do next is to place this on my fabric. I'll be using Ankara fabric to cut out this princess seam half bodice part. So I'm going to place this on my fabric and cut out my required pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around, with the exception of the side seam, which is going to have a 1 inch seam allowance. So here is my front pattern all cut out. So I've cut it out on fabric and lining, and I've gone ahead to interface all of them with stay fusible interfacing. So I gave my fabric a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around for this part, with the exception of the side seam, which has a seam allowance of 1 inch. Then for this part, I gave 1/2 inch seam allowance all around. My center front is going to be carrying a zipper, so I gave a zipper allowance of 1/2 inch. So right here is my back pattern. I cut my center back on fold, because my front pattern is carrying a zip in front. Okay, so I cut my center back on fold, and this is what we have here. And we have 1/2 inch seam allowance for the remaining part of our back bodice. And right here is the same thing. I have 1/2 inch seam allowance all around, with the exception of my side seam. So I fused the main fabric for my back pattern with fusible interfacing, and for my lining I used paper stay to fuse it. And what we want to do right now is to go on to sew our fabric pieces together by a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So right here is 1/2 of the front, and what I'm going to do is to take this to my sewing machine, sew the dart area all the way up to the armhole, sew it up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll repeat the same thing for the other front piece, the lining pieces, as well as the fabric pieces for my back pattern. So at the end of the day, I'm going to end up with 2 halves for the front piece and 1 whole piece for the back pattern. So guys, after sewing my pieces up together, this is what I have. Right here is my back piece for the main fabric. Right here is my front piece for the main fabric. So what we want to do next is to go on to sew the shoulder seam of the main fabric, and I'll repeat the same thing for my lining fabric. After sewing the shoulder seams, which is right here, I'll place the lining fabric, which I have sewn the shoulder seam as well. I'm going to place it right on top of the main fabric with right sides touching. And what I'm going to do is to sew the side seam of lining and main fabric together by a 1/4 inch. Come right here and do the same thing. Sew the side seam of the main fabric and lining fabric here by a 1/4 inch. Do the same thing for the front piece as well. Just place it on top like this. Sew this part down by a 1/4 inch, and repeat the same thing for the other front piece, because our front piece is divided into 2. Sew down the side seam of lining and main fabric by a 1/4 inch. After sewing, this is what we have. I'm going to go on to keep this aside so that we can cut what we are going to attach to the waist of this dress to make this into a full blouse. So I'll be cutting a 360-degree peplum. My waist is 34 inches, and we're going to be adding 1 inch to that, making that 35. Okay, so 34 plus 1, 35, and that 35 inches, we're going to divide it by 6.28, and that will give us 5.573. Okay, so we're going to approximate that to 5.75. If we have excess, it is not a bad thing. So now that we have calculated that to be approximately 5.75, I want the length of my peplum to be 9 inches. So we're going to add that 9 inches plus 5.75, and that will give us what, 14.75. So we're going to add 1 inch, which will be seam allowance for the bottom and the top, and that will make it what, 15.75. To manage your fabric, whatever you get, you're going to multiply it by 2. Okay, so that you can cut your fabric to that measurement. So what I've calculated now for mine is 15.75, and if we multiply it by 2, I should be getting 31.5. So what I'm going to do is to cut a 31.5 inch square. We are going to have 31.5 inch on this side, and 31.5 inch on this side. So by the time we fold it into 2, which is what I'm doing right now, by the time we fold it into 2 like this, and then fold it into 2 again, we are going to be having a 15.75 inch square. Do you understand? So this helps you to manage your fabric so you don't end up wasting fabric. So I'm going to start by marking 15.75 here. So I already have that right at the beginning. I'll just keep moving my tape rule little by little, continue marking 15.75 till I get to the other end. And once I'm done marking, I'm going to cut my fabric out like this, following the marking that I've made. So I'll just go on to cut it out like this. Okay, so remember the 5.75 that we calculated initially. For mine, I'll just come here and mark that 5.75 inches, so which is right here. Mark it across like this, 5.75 inches. Mark till I get to this other end. Okay, and I'm going to connect the points like so. Like I said, I want my peplum to be 9 inches, right? So you can see that what I have here is 10 inches, half an inch seam allowance here, half an inch seam allowance right here. So now that that is confirmed, I will go on to cut this part out like this. And now we have our peplum cut out. I'm going to use this as pattern to cut out the lining fabric, and of course I will go on to add fusible interfacing to the main fabric. So I used soft wadding for this peplum. I'm going to make a cut around where I want my zip to be in front. So I fold my circle in half, all right, and then I make that cut around one side, which I have notched previously. So I'll just go on to do that, and then I'll repeat the same thing for the lining fabric as well. So after cutting, I'm going to place my fabrics right sides to right sides and go on to sew with a half an inch seam allowance at the bottom all the way around. So after sewing my peplum by a half an inch at the bottom, this is what I have. I went on to do a top stitch by pushing the entire seam allowance towards the lining and taking this to my sewing machine and sewing about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam, right on top of the lining. The reason why I did that is so that the peplum can lay nicely at the bottom. So what I'm going to do right now is go on to press this down so that it lays nice and flat. Then I'm going to grab my bodice now. What I'm going to do is to turn this right sides out so that we can press our side seam area. So after pressing my bodice, this is what we have. So what I want to do right now is to go on to sew my side seam by my seam allowance. I've also pressed my peplum like I said I was going to do earlier. So I'll just keep my peplum aside and go on to work on the bodice. Go on to sew this by my seam allowance. So after sewing the bodice, what we want to do is to attach the peplum to the bodice. So what I did was to notch the midpoint of the flare or the peplum, which is around this point, and I have my center back notched as well. So that is the first place that we are going to pin down, and I'm going to be pinning the main fabric of the peplum to the bodice, the entire bodice, both main fabric and lining fabric. I'm going to match the notches and go on to pin it down. Then I'm going to move to the end of the peplum. Now remember that the measurement I used for my peplum was 5.75 instead of 5.5 something here. So we have a little bit of excess, but we're going to turn that excess into pleats. So I'm going to come right here now. But for this end, I'm going to pin only the main fabric to the main fabric of the peplum, because there's a way I want to sew this such that it is sort of neat on the inside. So just watch what I'm doing. I'm going to pin it like this, pin down, just like this. So I have a little bit of excess here, all right, and I'm going to pleat that excess to the back. So I'll straighten this part, pin to the side seam. You can see that I have a little bit of excess right here. Okay, so I'm going to be pinning that around the dart at the back of this bodice. So I'm just going to come right here, make a pleat. So after making the pleat, I will go on to pin this down. And I'm going to repeat what I have done here, what I've done for this half. I'll repeat it for the other half. So guys, I'm done pinning down, and I'm going to explain how we are going to sew this. I will not be sewing 1 inch from the edge of my fabric so that I can have the lining and main fabric of my bodice open this way. What I'm going to do is to go on to start 1 inch away from the edge. I'm going to sew all the way around, and we are attaching only the main fabric of our peplum to the main fabric and the lining fabric of our bodice. So you will notice that I pinned all of them together like this. So can you see? I'll be sewing by 1/2 inch all the way around, and I'm going to end up right here 1 inch away from the edge of my fabric here, because of how we want to attach our zipper and how we want the inside of this to be as neat as possible. So after sewing the waist area to the main fabric of the peplum, this is what I have. What we want to do next is to sew the lining part. So I'm going to sort of sandwich my bodice like this. Okay, so I'm going to place my bodice in between. Let me show you. So this is how my bodice will be placed, and I'll take this to my sewing machine and sew this on. Okay, so can you see what I'm doing? So it is going to be sandwiched in between while I sew. Meanwhile, I'm going to repeat the same thing I did for the main fabric, not sew from the beginning, sew about 1 inch away from the edge. When I get to where I did pleats for the main fabric, I'm going to repeat the pleats for my lining fabric as well until I get to this other end, 1 inch away from the edge. So after sewing my lining to the peplum, I'm going to pull whatever I have on the inside from this part that we haven't stitched. Okay, so we can have our peplum right back on the outside. So I'm just going to pull everything through, and you're going to see that we are going to have everything neatly done. Okay, so guys, now that we have everything right back out, this is what it looks like. And of course, you can see that we have this part here looking neat on the inside. So that is what we wanted to achieve. And now that we have done that, we want to work on how to fix our zipper. So remember that I said you should give like a 1 inch allowance right here so that we can be able to fix our zipper. So what I'm going to do now is take this part to my sewing machine. I'm going to take fabric to fabric. As you can see here, I'll take my fabric together like this. Okay, stitch from the edge down by a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll repeat the same thing for my lining. Grab my lining like this and stitch from the edge down. So I'm going to repeat what I've just explained here. Come right at the other end, do the same thing, main fabric and lining fabric, and stitch down. So after stitching it like I explained, we have these two parts separate like this, so we can go on to fix our zipper. I've done it for the other side as well, and this is what we have. And I went on to press the center front by the zipper allowance, which is 1/2 inch, for both the main fabric and the lining fabric. So what I'm going to do right now is to go on to sew my zipper, and it is an open and close zipper. Okay, so that's what I'm using, and I'm going to be attaching my zipper only to the main fabric. Okay, so I'll take this to my sewing machine, sew it up by the seam allowance, do the same thing for the other side, sew the zipper to the main fabric. Okay, not lining fabric, only main fabric by the seam allowance. So I've sewn my zipper on both sides, and this is what we have here. So you can see that the lining part is still open. Okay, I'm going to be using hemming tape to seal off this part, and it's going to appear really neat. So I'm not going to do any stitching for this lining part, just to seal it up. Put hemming tape underneath and then use my pressing iron to melt the hemming tape, because this is like glue and it will gum the fabric to the zipper. Now I want to mention something, that if you're using a plastic zip, be careful of your iron coming in contact with the teeth of the zip so that it doesn't deform your zip and then destroy it. Okay, so you want to be careful if you're using a hemming tape around the side because of your pressing iron. So better still, go for a metal zipper that opens and closes. That will be much safer. So now that we are done with the zipper, what we want to do right now is to go on to close off my neckline. So the fact that this part is still open is going to make it easy for me to close my neckline. So this is my full bodice. Okay, so I'm going to bring this one like this and then bring this part like this, and then I'm going to match my neckline like this. Okay, so can you see what I'm doing? And I'll go on to pin that down so we don't lose track. Then I'm going to grab my shoulder seam, which is the next bit, match it with the shoulder seam of my lining. So I'm going to pin that down just like this. I'll grab the other shoulder seam as well and repeat the same thing, okay? Then I'll move to the other center front where we have our other zip, match it as well, and then pin down. So what I'm going to do right now is to take this to my sewing machine. I'll be sewing my entire neckline by a 1/2 inch seam allowance from center front through the back and right back at the other center front. And then I'm going to cut off this excess zipper that we don't need so that we can properly close up our zipper right at the front. So guys, after sewing my neckline, this is what I have. Okay, so here's my neckline. When I was done, I did a top stitch on my neckline. Then I'll go on to notch my neckline because it is a round place and turn it right side out so that I can press it down and our neckline is looking nice, flat and neat. This is where we are going to bring our bodice out from the part of the zipper that is not attached to the lining. So I'll just go ahead and bring it right sides out. And voila, this is what we have. This is what our dress looks like right now. So what we want to do next is to cut our sleeve.
So for my sleeve, I'll be using this shirting fabric. This sleeve is going to be an exaggerated puff sleeve, and I'll be using a 180-degree flare to create this sleeve. Now we're going to do a little bit of calculation for this sleeve. So my round armhole is 18 inches. I'm going to multiply that 18 inches by 2, and that will give us 36 inches. Now, because I'm doing a 180-degree flare, I'm going to divide that 36 inches by 3.14, and that will give us 11.5, approximately 11.5 inches. So that is what we are going to be working with initially. Now, to this 11.5 inches, I'll be adding 17 inches for the sleeve length and add 1 inch for seam allowance at the top and at the bottom. So 11.5 plus 17 plus 1 inch, that will give me 29.5 inches, and that is the measurement that we'll be working with. So my fabric is folded into 2, and the part that is folded is measuring 29.5 inches, and if we open our fabric up, we're going to have 59 by 29.5 inches. So I'll be cutting my 2 sleeves at once, so that's why I have the 2 fabrics laying on top of each other like this. And what we're going to do is to mark that 11.5 inches that I calculated initially. Okay, so I'm going to grab my tape rule now, and I'm going to start marking that 11.5 inches. And I'm going to continue to move my tape rule like this from the edge of my fabric and continue to mark 11.5 inches till I get to the other end. So after marking, this is what I have, okay? And what I'm going to do is to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top right here. And then I'll go on to mark my sleeve length from that initial mark that we did. I'll be marking my sleeve length of 17 inches plus 1, that will be 18 inches. So you can see from my tape rule, I have 18 inches right at the bottom. And from that mark, I'll just continue to mark 18 inches all around like this, moving my tape rule until I get to the other end. And once I'm done marking, I'll go on to cut my fabric following the markings I've made at the top and at the bottom. So I've cut my fabric out now, and this is what we have for our sleeves, okay? So what we want to do next is to turn this into a puff sleeve, and I'm going to be making pleats on this fabric. So first off, I'm going to mark my seam allowance at the edge of my fabric. My seam allowance is 1/2 inch, so I'm just going to come to the edge right there and mark that. You can either go on to mark your seam allowance of 1/2 inch, or you go on to use a pin to hold it down so you know where your seam allowance is, okay? So I'm going to use a pin to hold that down, and I'm going to mark a point on this sleeve where I do not want to pleat, and I'll be marking 4 inches from my seam allowance. So I'll go on to mark that 4 inch right there, and I'll mark it on the other side of the sleeve because we are going to pleat the other side as well. So whatever I have left is what I'm going to pleat to create that puff effect. So I'll just be doing random pleats for the remaining part of the sleeve around the armhole. I'm just going to grab my fabric and create pleats. Now remember that I marked 4 inches on both sides of my fabric, which is where which is the part that I'm not pleating. So that will come to a total of what? 8 inches. And since my round armhole is 18 minus 8 will give me 10 inches. So the remaining part of this sleeve that I'm pleating, I would need to pleat it to 10 inches so that I can have, the measurement for my armhole all done when I'm done with this sleeve. So I'll just continue to do random pleats on both sides. So after pleating both sides, I'll go on to sew my sleeve with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I also sewed the top where I've pinned down so I can hold my fabric in place so that by the time we are attaching it to our bodice, it doesn't come off.
So guys, after stitching, this is what I have. This is the armhole of the sleeve. This is the parts that I stitched. What I want to do next is to go on to pleat this bottom of this sleeve to 10 inches. The reason I'm pleating this to 10 inches is because the sleeve is going to be somewhere around here, and my measurement, my circumference for this area is about 10 inches. So I'll go on to pleat this and stitch down to hold it in place. So after pleating the bottom, this is what it looks like right here. This is the part that is going towards the armhole, okay? If you use a 360-degree flare, it's going to be a lot more puffier than this. So I'm going to be attaching something like a cuff to this part. And what I've done is to cut my fabric pieces out. So right here is measuring 10.5 inches. A 1/4 inch is for seam allowance. Okay, so let me just open it up. So this is how it looks when opened up. I cut it out on fold actually. 5 inches on fold for this cuff part. So by the time we sew it by 1/4 inch, I'll be left with 10 inches, which will cover this part. And right here is my wrist circumference, which is 8 inches. So because this on fold, we have 8 divided by 2, that is 4 inches with 0.25 inch seam allowance. So I cut 2 pieces for each sleeve because we're going to line it with the same fabric. So what I'm going to do is take each piece to my sewing machine. I'm going to place them right side stretching, and I'm going to sew by a 1/4 inch all the way down. Sew by a 1/4 inch all the way down. And I forgot to mention my cuff length is 8 inches, inclusive of 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top and 1/2 inch seam allowance at the bottom here. So this is for one sleeve. I'll go on to repeat all that I've explained here for the other sleeve parts. So after stitching it down by a 1/4 inch, what we are going to do next is to turn one right side out. And I'm going to put this one that I've turned, I'm going to insert it into this one that we have the wrong side still out. So I'll just make sure to match the seam, okay, and then just push it in, just like this. And what I'm going to do is to take this to my sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch the entire bottom by a 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure that my seams match. So after stitching the bottom, I'm going to pull one of it out like this, and then push it back in so we can have our lined cuff. All right, and then I'm going to give this a good press so that the edge of this, the bottom of this cuff is nice and neat. And what I'm going to do also is to fold this part in the top of the cuff in. I'm going to fold it in by a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press it down so that it will be easy for us to attach it to the puff sleeve that we have just made. So I only pressed one part of the cuff sleeve, 1/2 inch seam allowance in right here, just one. So what I'm going to do is to insert this into my puff sleeve. Now my puff sleeve has the wrong sides out, so I'm going to insert this right into it, and I'm going to make sure that the seam on the cuff matches this seam right here. So I place it like this, and then I'm going to take it to my sewing machine. Now we're going to be stitching the parts that I did not press the 1/2 inch seam allowance in. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and stitch it by a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around. So now that we are done stitching the first half of the cuff, what we want to do is to cover up the raw edges, which is on this side. Okay, so we want to cover up the raw edges with the one that we pressed 1/2 inch seam allowance in, just to make it easy for us. So in order for me to do that, I'm just going to make sure that I push the raw edge towards the cuff, okay? I push it towards the cuff, and that 1/2 inch seam allowance is going to cover it. And what I'm going to do is to stitch right on top of it, okay? So I'll be stitching from the outside to hold it on the inside. I stitch right on top of it all around, making sure that I check intermittently, okay, so that we don't go off course, we don't stitch in the wrong place without holding that fabric in on the inside. So this is what is going to help me achieve that neat sewing, pinning it down before going on to stitch it on. Okay, so just go ahead and do that for yours, and you will see that you're going to end up with a neat finish at the end of the day.
So after stitching, this is what it looks like on the right side, and I'll use the other sleeve to show you what it looks like on the wrong side. So as you can see, it looks really neat. So what we want to do next is to attach this to our bodice. Before we go on to fix the sleeve, what I'm going to do is to take this my bodice to my sewing machine and sew about 1/4 inch around the armhole, just to hold it in place so that by the time we're fixing our sleeve, the fabrics are not shifting. So we need to turn our bodice like this with the wrong side out, and we're going to be placing our sleeve on the inside. So like I said, we're going to stitch all around. First, we need to find the midpoint of my sleeve by using the seam of the sleeve as a guide. So once you do it like this, you get the middle of the sleeve head, and that is it right there. And I'm going to be placing the right side of my sleeve, touching the right side of my bodice, making sure that the middle of the sleeve matches with the shoulder seam around the armhole. Okay, so this is what I have, and I'm going to match the underarm of my bodice to the seam on the sleeve like this, and go on to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance.
So after sewing the sleeve to the bodice, this is what it looks like on the inside. And what I want to do next is to go on to attach a belt to this dress so that we can have, more fitting. So I have cut my fabric for the belt piece, and I cut a really long piece because I want this belt to wrap around my body. So the width of my belt piece is around 7.25 inches, and the length is 58 inches inclusive of seam allowance. So that is exactly how I wanted it. Now what I want to do for this belt piece is to make the tip sort of a bit pointed. So I'm going to fold it into 2 like this. Then I'll mark 4 inches upwards like so, and connect that 4 inches to this point here. Okay, so I'll just go on to get my ruler and connect it like this. And we are going to cut this out. So I'll be repeating the same thing for the second belt piece. And what I'm going to do next is to sew here by 1/4 inch. So this part by 1/4 inch. So this part all the way to the top by 1/4 inch. After sewing the belt pieces, what I'm going to do is to turn it right sides out. Okay, so I'm just going to use my scissors to do that. So I just push it in like this, and then use my scissors to push the rest of the fabric out. So I'll just poke out the end right here, and then I'll pull the fabric out like this and go on to press it down. So I'll repeat the same thing for the other belt piece before going on to attach it to our dress. After turning and pressing my belt piece, what I'm going to do right now is to insert it into the side seam of my bodice. So I'm just going to insert this piece here by 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch, and then stitch it down like this. Okay, do the same thing for the other belt piece, and we are done, guys. What's left is for me to use hemming tape on this side of my center front where my zipper is. Use hemming tape, press it down to seal this part up. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, kindly give us a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, turn on the bell so you get updates when I post new videos, and I'm going to be seeing you guys in my next tutorial. Bye!